All right, I'm Harry, and I am a software engineer here at Stash, and I want to talk about creating financial opportunity, specifically carrying the idea of empathy from product through engineering. It seems that empathy is kind of something that's preached in the product world, and then when it gets to the engineering portion, sometimes it kind of stops, and then things get built and things get tested, and you lose sense of the customer. So I'm on the advice team, and our general mission, this is kind of my wording, not the wording we actually use, but it's to provide users with the tools and guidance to empower them to make their own financial decisions. So Stash, we want to make personal finance, financial tools accessible to everybody. We want to democratize investing, banking, but to us that doesn't mean necessarily telling people exactly what to do. We less want to do that and more of get people to the point where they can make financial decisions themselves. The finances aren't making the decisions for them. This is here, I'm an engineer, I don't usually make slides, so I asked if we have a Stash theme. We don't. I feel like that's the first lesson in empathy. Even business people can do it. Are people here business people or product people or engineers? Business people need to have empathy too. I do not know how to make an engaging PowerPoint. I don't know how to use Excel without my mouse. So tools like that would just be helpful. I threw in some GIFs though, so hopefully it makes things a little more entertaining. But at Stash we follow this product life cycle. It's very similar to the one you just previously saw. But just on a high level, the first step is you empathize. Second step, you strategize. Third step, ideate, and then you build, measure, and learn. And what I want to do is go through each step, talk about how it relates to a product that we recently worked on, and then kind of go cover a few gotchas that I think are the ones that come up frequently. This is a really long-winded problem statement about the problem that we were thinking of. You can read it as I explained to you, but the big takeaway from it is that a lot of people do not save for a retirement account. So a survey from the Fed said that 25% of non-retired adults have no retirement savings at all. So a quarter of non-retired adults don't have any retirement savings. We've done our own surveys. Our user base skews a little more lower income. We saw that 40% of people aren't saving for retirement. And that the stat that I think kind of blows my mind is almost 50% simply think that retirement is too far away. So there's a clear gap there, right? There's the gap between understanding that, yeah, it is far away. That's why you want to save now, because then you have more money later. So which takes us to the first step, which is just empathizing, just understanding what is going on with the users, understanding what we know about the problem, understanding how we mitigate our biases, and really just get down to what's going on. So I don't know, this is kind of trying make it interactive in a certain way. So when you think about retirement in your life, when you think about your friends or family, this is probably something that's come up at least once. What have you noticed about people? What do people think about retirement? What do people think about retirement savings? We're all financially, I guess, inclined, so we might be biased to be like, oh, my employer offers a 401k, obviously I'm thinking of retirement already.
They're secretive.
They're secretive? Do you have anything more to say about that?
Yeah, like they don't tell you what type of accounts they might have, not have, how they're preparing for it. It's very like, oh, I have my strategy, even if the strategy might not be a valid one.
Yeah, there's almost like this sense of it being taboo, right? Like you don't want people to know about your finances. People don't talk about salaries, how much they have saved. Maybe they're embarrassed about what they've saved. Is this enough? Am I doing as well as other people? Anybody got anything else?
It's complicated.
Yeah, it's hard as hell. I actually learned I was over-contributing to a Roth IRA while literally building retirement accounts at Stash because I was implementing the rules to prevent you from over-contributing. And I was like, hey, Mary Alexa, I think you made a mistake. And no, I was wrong. And that was like a pretty aggressive tax. Anything else? One more person, just throw something out. Or not, I'll tell you what we found. But what empathy is not open a retirement account. It's the same way that people can sometimes approach problems incorrectly, like we want to build a digital financial advisor. Like we don't want to build a digital financial advisor. If financial advisors had it all figured out, we wouldn't be a viable business. We want to figure out what financial advisors aren't doing, what people need, and fill that gap. So it's not helpful for people to be like, you're not saving for retire, just do it, because that doesn't connect. What empathy is, though, is asking them why they're not doing it and getting quotes like this. So, oh gosh, it's a quick spark of anxiety, and then I get happily, easily distracted, which is terrible. Like, they're wanting to get distracted from the thought since I'm on my phone and I get another notification. Another person, I don't care, I'm 30, I'm worried about bills. Someone else just says, who knows where I'm gonna be when I'm older? Some people just want the money now. And the last one, which connects to me the most, I have to think about dying and I just don't want to. Which is fair. It's the same reason why when we talk about life insurance, it's like, I don't want to die. I don't want to think about that. I thought that for myself personally when I was getting my license renewed and they asked if I wanted to be an organ donor. And for some reason, I thought that if I didn't say yes, I wouldn't die. From empathy, you kind of develop a user problem. So this isn't necessarily the silver bullet, but it's kind of a little bit farther along than you were in the beginning. And to us, that problem was users have anxieties about saving for retirement. They think that they can lose it all by investing. They don't know about the subject matter and they lack the confidence to start, so it's complicated. People are afraid that they're gonna mess things up because of the perceived complexity, and just getting old sucks. This brings us to step 2. So we kind of have a better idea now of how the users are feeling, and we need to strategize and think of how do we attack this problem? Where do we fill the gaps in our understanding? Because if there were no gaps, we would have nailed it. People would all have retirement accounts if it was necessary. Everyone would be happy. They would get old, not a problem at all. So you kind of come up with an initial hypothesis, and this isn't something to really go off yet, but it's something to guide you. And one of the kind of hypotheses we use is if and then. So for us, we were saying if we address the user's anxieties about retirement and it is appropriate for them to begin retirement savings, then they will be more likely to convert. And the reason all these components are necessary is because you need to, 1, address the problem, 2, have a way to fix it. If you don't have a way to fix it, you're not gonna do anything. And then you want an outcome. If you don't have an outcome, what are you doing? You're just guessing. So we have progress right now. We're making some headway. Now we kind of know where we're heading and we wanna actually come up with an idea. So you have the hypothesis and you ask yourself, how do we actually do this? And this is where we involve the whole team. Just because you're a product manager, just because you're maybe like have domain knowledge in retirement specifically doesn't mean you have the right ideas. We are all people, we all deal with personal finance, and anybody can come up with one. I also say that because I'm an engineer and I get very salty if I'm not included. I want to give my input. So again, for the audience, so when you think about retirement, given the problems, if you were to just spitball a couple ideas of how you could address them, what do you think?
Make it a game.
Make it a game? What do you mean by that?
How you rank against others, where you stand.
So why do you say that?
But it takes your mind off of all those terrible things like dying and getting old.
So make something shitty fun.
Yeah.
That's reasonable. Anybody got anything else?
Automate the deduction.
Why about that? How does that address the problem?
You don't feel the pain. It comes out before you even see it after tax.
That's a good way. Automated savings is great for these types of accounts. Anyone else?
Simple, digestible content, like educational, but really easy to take in.
Yeah, just break down the differences. Like with Roth IRA versus traditional, there's pretty much one core difference that you can communicate to people. But if you look it up on the IRS website, it's really aggressive. But this is hard because you have the problem and then it's all fun and games and you have to figure out, okay, how do I actually fix this? And that's why it's hard. That's why there's a lot of companies trying to do similar things. That's why they're all competitive. At this point, we take our hypothesis to something a little more specific when we have the solution, where we want to address the problem, how we're going to solve the problem, and then the expected result we're going to have. So the problem is what we mentioned before. People have anxiety about saving for retirement. In our case, we thought the way to address this problem is to have a conversational format to address their anxieties proactively and then help them feel understood. So we knew what they're anxious about and we'll make it seem more like we're talking to them and getting their input and then showing them why what they think is so bad isn't so bad. And then you need the result. We think that if we do that, people will be more likely to open an IRA and make their initial transfer. So we want them to open an account, and then we want them to actually fund the account and take that first step. An important caveat with this, which is something that we keep in mind and I didn't explicitly state, is we want the people that should be doing this to be the ones that do. And I think this is kind of part of the empathy also. I mean, obviously for us, retirement is a great account. It's hard to take your money out. There's a fee associated with it. In terms of like lifetime value of a customer, yeah, if every customer on Stash had a retirement account, it'd be fantastic for business. But in terms of like a business, it's only good if we're offering the correct advice. If you're stuck with debt and you can't pay your debt, and we lock you into a retirement account and you're funding that instead of paying off something way more pressing, that doesn't create a good relationship between us and the customer. It's not good for the customer. It's not good for anybody. When they lose, we lose. So we have a plan of attack. Now we actually have to build it. And this is where the handoff kind of goes more to engineering and things can fall apart. So just because we're building something doesn't mean that the work's done, because the idea is great, but until it's in front of somebody, then it doesn't do anything. So one common issue that we see a lot with just tech companies in general, and this isn't a Stash specific problem, if any of you are at tech companies, you'd probably see this also, is that people tend to over-engineer MVPs. It's the engineering way. Engineers like complex problems. They like solving things. It's not fun to do a one-line code change. But there's kind of a culture that you have to consider about whether or not you're incentivizing hard engineering work or you're incentivizing valuable engineering work. And this is where empathy is really important. Because something simple that we did previously was adding a positive sign to your return on your portfolio. So until then, if you had gained money, we'd say you were just up $100. And if you were down, it was minus $100. And a really, really small change, it took me about 5 minutes to do because it's adding a plus sign in our code base, was when you're positive, you say positive. And it's something we didn't explicitly measure, but we saw a lot of feedback and screenshots in forums and our Facebook groups and just people talking about how it made them feel better about their returns. And that's not fun engineering work. I wasn't totally thrilled. I'm not gonna put that on my resume. It's not gonna be something that I talk about in a future job interview, but it's something that added value. So there's this problem of value versus complexity, what's fun versus what's worthwhile. And there's a balance that you need to find where you obviously don't want every engineering project to be boring. You want to attract talented engineers, you want them to be engaged, and you want to kind of build a culture where people are excited about the work they're doing. But excited doesn't have to just be technical. You should be excited about easy engineering work that made a big difference in people's lives. So with these check-ins, this questionnaire, there's different types of things we could have done. We could have done different types of questions, fill in the blank, multiple choice, draw a picture, anything. We could have had deep learning. People love saying that, and it's very trendy, but it doesn't do a lot in practice for a lot of simple problems, but it's fun. All these different possible ways to do this project, but at the end of the day, it's just a questionnaire. And our questionnaire is supposed to get people more comfortable with retirement. And at the end of the day, the easier we do it, the quicker it gets to them, the more value we can absorb quicker. So takeaway number one, incentivize value. Something that we do at Stash is we do epic closeout meetings, and it's a way to kind of keep the focus on the accomplishments you're making and not just the work you're doing. So before we start every major project, we set goals that we want, the expectations we think we're gonna see at the end of what we're going to see at the end. Just to get a gauge of how we prioritize work. We want to prioritize work that's gonna add the highest value in the least amount of time. And at the end, we need to validate these assumptions. And this is where we kind of incentivize the value part of the engineering work, where we go through, we check the metrics that we expected, we see whether or not they hit those standards or missed them, figure out why, and then document them. So we had an epic here, is event-based validations. This was actually exciting technical work, so this doesn't necessarily make my point, but the point is that we reduced the load time of a major endpoint on our app to a quarter of what it initially was. And it's important to really put the focus there. People want to know what they're doing. People want to know the value they're adding. And you also want to try to show that when you're doing valuable projects, you're making more progress. Another common issue number two, I know there's probably more product people here than engineers, is feature creep. So engineers are guilty about over-engineering. Product people are guilty about the feature creep. And that's usually a result of the broken feedback loop where you'll be like 2 weeks into building something and then you bring up the question, what about this? Like, what about these questions? What about this functionality? What happens if we tweak the design a little bit? And you think you're saving time because you think that oh, I understand the customer, I know what's gonna work, let's get this in earlier to prevent a test later on. But if we knew what worked, we wouldn't be testing, we wouldn't all be viable companies, we wouldn't be competitive, we would have just known what to do. And we really have to stress the V in MVP, where there's two sides of it, where there's one side that all you need is to be viable. It doesn't need more than that. You don't need every feature, you need enough for it to be viable. And then just remember the other side, where it has to be viable. Like, if you were to do no more work on it, it should be a sustaining product in and of itself, even if it's not perfect. And then about saving time, it's just being disciplined. So creating an environment where it's okay for people to say no and say, you know what, this is a great idea. I know it's a little brutal, just no. But no, this is a great idea, but this is probably for another test. Some way that we help enforce that is just using checklists. Checklists, I'm a big fan of them. And the checklist that we have is just things that need to be done and signed off of before all planning freezes and development work starts. And once development work starts, then anything else is saved for a future iteration unless it's really, really critical. And that ends up saving time, even though you think you're jumping the gun or even if you think you're saving time by getting maybe a future test rolled into the first one because you're dead set on it, it probably saves time in the end. As engineers, we want to build things that hit the requirements, but also are flexible for the potential iterations ahead. And then what happens when features get thrown in the middle is it kind of ruins the context for that, and you don't know what's actually viable now, what's necessary later on. And the back and forth between trying to build generally and then holding on to the features that other people want, that's when you create this back and forth that ends up taking more time than you think you're saving. Common issue number 3, not building for the customer. So not building what the customer wants is the product version of this. The engineering is not building what the customer can do. So you want to know where they are. If you have a product that targets people on Android devices for whatever reason, then don't build it on web, don't build it on iOS, build it on Android. You want to understand what their conditions are. If they're 3G versus LTE, this is an example that I'll show afterwards. You want to be able to keep that in mind so when you're designing your infrastructure, viable is something that is viable under their conditions. You might have something that's viable in terms of it works, but that might only work on high-speed internet. If it's not viable on the network conditions that your users are in, then it's not viable. And then more other, like what's their financial situation, anything you can think of, you just need to really understand who the customer is and then build appropriately. I don't know if these videos are gonna work, but this is my example about Wi-Fi, and there's just like a way to actually show what we ended up doing. So this is kind of what the questionnaire looks like for our MVP, and this is how it functions on good Wi-Fi. So it's pretty smooth. You answer the question, you get the next question, and continue. And we had to test this on, oh, I don't know how to continue this slide while it's playing. Oh no. Okay, but then bad 3G, and it's something that we had to test because we know a lot of people use mobile web on poor network conditions. So we needed to make sure it worked too. And it's not great. You can see the loading, there's a bit of latency, but this actually impacted our design a little bit. There was a contract that we were deciding whether or not we wanted the questions to be submitted, and then you request another question. And then we settled on a contract that minimized the amount of network requests back and forth, because even though they were a little more complex from an engineering perspective, we knew that the delay in those network conditions didn't make it viable. What was viable was that it's still usable. Keep going. Step 5, measure. And this is also where empathy comes in, because especially in companies, and this has to do with how you incentivize culture, sometimes people are tempted to fudge the results and make it seem like something was successful, even if it wasn't successful. So just because your test failed, it's not bad. You don't have to force your hypothesis to be true. And I think the biggest stink is when people aren't picking their metrics before they run their test. This was clear in the last presentation, but you want to know what you're testing before you test, because when you're running a lot of tests and you're checking a lot of metrics, it's really easy to say, oh, we thought that retirement account open rates would increase, but actually they didn't. But if you look over here, we saw that people are doing more of this that's not related. And then you go to your boss and say, I caused this bump, I did great. And maybe they believe you, and if they do, good for you, like if you get raises, but at the end of the day, you didn't add value to people. P-hacking could be good if you want to fake success, but it's not success. And you want to create an environment where the failure is good. So our metrics, we did retire conversion rate, retire funded rate, and retire learn engagement. So step 6 is you learn. So if it worked, that's great, but then it's only great if you know why it worked. Because then if you know why it worked, then you know what you can continue doing. And if it didn't work and you know why it didn't work, then you know kind of what to address and you prevent people from making the same problems over and over. And it's really asking yourself the question, do we pivot or do we persevere? And it's important to keep in mind because it's tempting to say, we did it, it tested well, nailed it, done. And if you don't, you have to kind of make this decision. Should we keep going? If it shows promise, then keep going. And if it doesn't show promise, how do we change it so that it does? And if you do nothing, then you're just good enough and you haven't solved the problem. So this is a quote that someone said, I forget where, it's like on a Confluence doc or in Slack or something, but they said, do not hesitate to step up and say, we ran a test that lost. Our hypothesis was wrong, here's what we learned. In fact, if you aren't losing once in a while, many will become skeptical if your wins are actually real. So the point of this, which I really love, is that you should probably be failing more than you win, and if you do, that's okay. Because either way you look at it, you're gaining information. If it didn't work, you learned that your assumption was incorrect. And if it did work, you learned it was correct. And incorrect and correct doesn't really, they're both equally important. So what we learned, I screwed this up. I made this deck and I was waiting to fill this in for the results to finish, and we found out recently that it was misconfigured. Oops. So I was like so ready to say, oh, this worked or didn't work, but we don't know. But what we did learn was, this is very early analysis, that it has high engagement rate. 40% of people who saw this check-in have started it. It's a high completion rate. People aren't dropping off. 85% of people who start it finish it. We need more data to identify if it actually works on converting, which is the important metric. Other things we learned just from the process, because the process is important too, which is making opportunity cost tangible is really, really hard. And this is probably something that all personal finance companies are going to have to deal with at some point or the other. Long-term growth is abstract. Opportunity cost is abstract. All these concepts are very abstract, and it's not unreasonable for people to get confused by it. What our job collectively is to make it tangible. So when something's abstract, how do we break it down to the most simple blocks and make it clear to them? Because once it's clear to people, then it's accessible. And if it's accessible, then people are better off. Something else we learned is that people like involvement in their decisions. And this is something that we also thought was pretty universally applicable to financial companies. So people don't like being told what to do. They like being part of the decision. And this is something that we were able to get from UXR and early testing with this, that we're able to apply elsewhere in the company, which is, we know where to lead them, but we want them to lead themselves. So just to wrap it up, these are my 2 cents, the takeaways that I think are important. Empathy doesn't stop after you identify your hypothesis. You can come up with a problem, that's great, but unless you build it correctly, it can only do so much. Incentivize value over complexity. Building a culture where people celebrate adding value to people's lives, not just adding value to their resumes. Remain disciplined. It's really hard. It's very tempting to just jump in and say you want to change something. But the more disciplined you are, over time, you see a lot more efficiency in your process. Know your customer. If you don't know your customer, what are you doing? How are you solving their problems? And then celebrate failure. Failure is very, very good. People shouldn't be afraid to say they screwed up. And people should be actively telling people what they were wrong about so that other people don't also make the same mistakes. And that is all I got, so I'll open it up for questions if anyone has any. Tom's in the back. I'm an obligatory "we're hiring" comment too, if you're interested. But if no questions, that's okay too. All right. Thank you.